This conference is now being recorded.
Welcome to the New York State Association of School Business Officials webinar. Today's program is Grant Finance webinar. Your host for today is Donna Clement, Director of Professional Development, New York State ASBO. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing #. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions at any time during the presentation using the chat window indicated by a speech bubble icon located to the right of the presentation. Please address chat questions to the Q&A group using the drop-down list located at the bottom of the chat window. I will now turn the call over to our host, Donna. You may begin.
Thank you, Leo, and welcome everyone to the webinar about grants financing. And we're pleased to have Star Pombrio, who is the treasurer from Questar Bothses, with us today. And Harry Hadjuano will be joining us, but presently he's not with us. But make sure you ask your questions, get your information. Star and Harry have put together, I believe, a very informative webinar for you. And I'm going to turn it over to Star.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We are hoping to give you a little more information on some of the things that we have learned over our years of administering grants, and things have been changing rapidly in the last few months. So we're hoping to update you with a little more information to hopefully keep you current and get your money as quickly as possible. And Harry will be joining us. He apologizes for being a little late. He had a conflict with another meeting that's running a little long. Now, here at Questar, one of the things that we do as before we even begin to think about whether or not a grant is for us, is we look at the proposal and we evaluate it on a couple of different levels with a few different groups of people who may potentially have an interest in the funding source. And we want to make sure that we're just not grabbing money for the sake of applying for a grant. Will it be something that furthers our purpose, meets our goals? Sometimes you get notice of a grant and you don't even qualify for the funding because the 404Bs frequently it's only for a school district. And the other thing is there's sometimes timelines in there for either submitting a quality grant proposal or deliverables that we may not be able to meet. So we really try to look at all of these things. And then we also look at, the saying is the juice worth the squeeze? Are there so many hurdles or objectives or deliverables that we would not be able to meet, or it would be putting an additional burden on the organization if we were trying to meet the objectives of the funding? So is everything worthwhile, and can we get it all together in a timely fashion? And if the answer is, of course, yes, then we more or less try to identify the person, program manager, owner, whatever you try to call these folks, who is going to be the person to realistically administer the grant from the program side. We usually set up a meeting rather early on in the planning process, and it involves the business office, it involves the program group. We go through the proposal, the RFP, the application, the invitation, whatever is out there for a grant, and we make a few determinations. Who's going to write the grant? We have the luxury here at Questar of having a grant writer. However, she serves our district, so she may not always be available to write a grant at the time that our proposals need to be submitted. We look at the financial information and decide who's going to provide what pieces of information, and if there's more than one party, we make sure that there's a timeline and things are delivered in a timely fashion, because we don't want to be stalled waiting for information from someone who can't deliver it on time. We need to review the completed application as a quality control check before the superintendent has to put his signature on it. We want to make sure that it's complete, it's presentable, everything has been addressed. And then we make sure that whoever is responsible for submitting the application to the granting agency makes sure it's done on time. Then we make sure we get our copies back to both the business office and the program offices while we're waiting for a response. Now, a few of the things that we look at when we're going through the grant proposal is make sure you're able to answer all of the questions, and when you're putting the proposal together, try to format it in the way that they are laying out the requirements, because there's usually points awarded for every single section of it. And we're consistent in terminology. That's one of the things that really makes a quality proposal. And STAED at a couple of sessions a while back more or less stated that they were desiring to get a better quality of proposal. That and it's important as the funding gets tighter that you do have good flow to your grants, that everything is included, it's well written, consistent. And one of the things we found is that you need to keep checking back at the website for any updates. Q&A responses can be critical. We responded to one proposal last year, and right up a few days before the proposal was due, there were additional clarifications on some of the allowable costs that were put forth on the website. So it's very critical to keep up to date with whatever is out there. And then one of the things that we've done is we have more or less a set packet of historical and statistical data that we use and refer back to when we're doing all of our grant applications. And it keeps things consistent, and it prevents us from reinventing the wheel at every time we go to do a grant. So we've got some of this information at the ready, and we update it as we need it. Now, one of the things that we've discussed in our groups is making sure that if you've got staff in a grant, if they'll be funded through a grant, making sure that the titles are appropriate. Now, there's some new things that have come up recently where there is the teachers on special assignment, and frequently we use one of these people in our grants, and that may be an issue where the person needs to be available for 12 months. So teachers are usually paid over a 10-month period. You need to make sure that the salary and benefits are aligning, and if there is some title issues or whatever bargaining contract impact that might crop up, that you think about that, because sometimes that could be an issue. The other thing that we have to be careful of is when you're allocating part-time personnel, the percentage of fringe benefits should be the same percentage as the percentage of the FTE of the salary allocated. You can't allocate 100%, and neither should you just put in 0. Fringe benefits can be a pretty costly part of a person's salary, and they are allowable in a grant if you've got the salary piece in, so make sure that that's there. One of the things that we have been cited for and had a lot of audit review on is matching funds components. Federal grants, a lot of them have matching funds, and when you're preparing a grant proposal, what you need to think about is what resources from the general fund side or from other programs, not grant programs, but other programs, school lunch, wherever, that you have will be used as a match. You have to keep pretty detailed records to support the costing out of that match, and make sure that if things change over the period of the time for the grant, that you keep monitoring the matching component, because sometimes your grant funding can be impacted if you don't have the correct matches. When you're going through, prepare your budget and your narratives and make sure that they line up, that you're not saying one thing in the narrative and then putting something different completely in the budget. They do look at both pieces, and it is something that should line up and be consistent. You also want to make sure you're using the most recent indirect rate that is issued by state ed. These letters usually come out in the spring, May, June. They have come out as late as July, but the indirect is to cover the cost of your administration, which is basically your business office costs. However, not all grants allow an indirect. There are some that don't. So that's part of looking into the RFP or the grant invitation or application to make sure that they are allowed. Because if you put it in, it's disallowed, then it impacts the total amount of the grant, and sometimes they will not reallocate your indirect funds to another category, and you've just lost funding, and that's something you don't want to happen. We do try to make sure that we get as accurate a cost as possible. We don't want to be in a situation where we have to do a lot of amendments. So we do spend some time trying to get a good idea of what we are going to spend in different areas of the grant to make sure that we don't spend a lot of time redoing the budget pieces and looking for a grant amendment through state ed. It's not always possible, but we do try to do the best we can. Now, the other thing that we've done, and it's mostly because we have, grants are usually the place where new program people get their first opportunity to manage a budget. And the short form, the FS20, is very handy if you're very familiar with grants, and a lot of times the submission only asks for the FS20, which basically is the front page of the FS10 and the last page of the FS10 with the columns where you have all of the basic costs totals. We sometimes suggest that people use the long form, the FS10, because it gives very good information all the way through about the types of costs that are to be included under every category. And it really is helpful to the new people to understand what is a purchase service. It includes the consultants, rentals, tuition, contractual. Sometimes people don't understand the basic terminology of the headings, so the FS10 is a very nice roadmap, and while it may look like a term paper to some people to fill out all the costs, it also provides a very good guidance document as you're administering the grants in the coming months, because you know exactly what was put in for each of the line items, and it provides a lot more detail. I have listed the website links to the New York State Ed Grants Finance Unit and the forms, and the forms do come in PDF, Excel, and Word. So they're very handy. It's whatever your people's preference are. Some people aren't as adept at working at Excel as others. But we pretty much use the Word format here only because most of our folks that are in the grant writing area aren't very familiar with Excel. So it just depends on what your preference is and how your people are comfortable, what they're comfortable working with. This is an example of our indirect rate letter. We keep these on file for multiple years, and I will tell you that we did have an SED audit of one of our grant programs a couple of years ago, and we did have to pull out all of our indirect rate letters because they went back 4 or 5 years. This thing usually comes out, like I said, in the spring, and most of the grants that we will be applying for in both the school district or a BOCES side will mostly use the restricted rate. We have had very infrequent occurrences where we've used the unrestricted, and I can tell you that that has been only in grants that were directly awarded from the federal government, and we've only had 1 or 2 of those ourselves. So it's really the restricted rate that you're trying to deal with, and that is to cover the cost basically of your business office. They don't normally allow you to allocate costs for clerical and support personnel. One of the things that we do before we let the superintendent have the grant application to sign is we have a routing and review process, and the business office plays a critical role in that. We make sure we read through the RFP, we read through the narrative that has been presented from the program offices. We also redo all the calculations and do a review of the costs to make sure they're reasonable. We have developed a fringe benefit worksheet that we use. Some program folks are able to prepare that sheet themselves. Other times the business office actually prepares it for them, but it develops all of the costs that we have for each particular position, and includes everything from Social Security, ERS, TRS, unemployment, whatever the particular costs are for a bargaining unit, and we fill it in so that we have an idea of what our total fringes are. We look to make sure that things look reasonable as far as proposed costs. Sometimes there's something that's written in a narrative that will trigger a question in our minds of whether or not there's going to be additional costs to us. Those are what we call the hidden costs. We want to make sure that if there's something in there that we're going to have to do that might not be covered by the grant, then if we're having to spend money, where is that money coming from? We also review that matching fund calculation, make sure that there is a reasonable basis for the matching funds, because at some point, if it's a federal grant or a state grant, you may have to defend your matching funds assumptions to be sure that you're getting all the federal grants. Clerical accuracy is also another thing that we look for to make sure that we haven't made any mistakes. Here's an example of our fringe benefit worksheet, and for any of you folks who would like a copy of this, just send me an email and we will shoot off a copy of it. We update it every year with whatever our new fringes are, and we find it very helpful in evaluating all of our grants. After your grant gets to state ed, you usually always send it to the program office, and they review it, score it, evaluate it. Then if it's approved and it passes their process, it'll go on to Grants Finance. The State Comptroller's Office may also play a role in this, depending on the funding source. There are also some things that are multi-year grants that are called grant contracts. We have had several of those. We still do have several of those. They usually run from 3 to 5 years in time, and a lot of times, because they're multi-year, they have to have approval from the Attorney General's office and the Department of Budget. The more levels of approval that you need from the state or the federal government, the longer the time is while you're waiting to hear whether or not you're the winner. And frequently, as is the case, we end up being several months into the school year and finding out that we've won a grant. And we do have one ourselves pending right now. We're at January 21st, and the funding period is actually July 1 to June 30 of 2010. We expect to get notice that we're going to be awarded that grant, but it's going to make administering the funding much trickier for us. So it pays to be very proactive and submit a quality grant proposal up front, because you may have a shorter timeline to spend your funds. Well, now's the good news. You received your funding letter, and then what do we do next? This is the official notice of funding that comes out of the Grants Finance area, and we keep the original of these in the business office. There are a number of key pieces of information on this that we find very helpful. The first is the project number, number 2 up at the top. We need to know what that is so that when we're completing our reimbursement request, the FS-25, or amendments, the FS10As, or the finals, the FS10Fs, that project number has to be on all of our correspondence. The funding source. This year the Teacher Centers were funded through ERA funding, completely new funding source for us because in the past it has been state funds. This ups the ante quite a bit because now we're under the federal compliance guidelines. It also gives us the law, the ERA law of 2009, regulations, EGR. EGR is another federal requirement. It's educational guidelines. We have to make sure that we're now familiar with those. The funding dates, okay, that's pretty clear-cut. Approved budget, that's what we submitted for. Number 8 is the CFDA index number. That's the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance. That index number also points us to additional requirements for the funding. That number is also going to be a critical number for our external auditors when they're providing us with our external audit, because we have to also do a statement of sources of federal funding. And because we're obviously getting over $500,000 or spending over $500,000 in federal funds, that's going to trigger the single audit. So that's a pretty important number to know because there's additional reporting requirements. The final report date, 9/28/10. That is also a very important date for us to know because we have to make sure that we're timely in our submissions. We have pretty much the same SED contact on all of our grants. From time to time, it may be helpful to phone the person if you have questions or you're wondering where an amendment is. On the other side of it is the program folks. Your program people that are administering grants need to know who their key contacts are, and this clearly spells it out. And as you can see, we got our funding letter on November the 17th of 2009, and if you look at the funding date, it's July 1 of 2009. So we've got some time to be making up for. Now for the grant compliance, I've listed one of the best documents for any kind of grants, especially from state ed, is they've got a very nice website. It gives a whole bunch of their forms, their guidelines, their frequently asked questions, and that's going to the state ed website, and it's in the operations and management services, and it's under grants. And if you aren't familiar with that, I suggest you go in, you play around with that area. It gives you status of grants. If you look around, you can go in and find out prior years' funding. It also gives you a lot of resources. But one of the best pieces of advice is they've got a fiscal guidelines packet, and it's about 10 pages long. They've recently revised it in 2009, and it is very helpful to answer a lot of questions as you're going along with costs for the grants and what to put in. We also have the link to the CFDA, the Catalog of Federal Domestic Assistance, because all of the districts got additional funding through ERA this year, and that's going to be something that you really do need to become aware of. And they have given, the state ed has given out a sheet to point to which CFDA number parts of the ERA funding are coming from, so you may want to go there. And it is a big website. It's got a lot of stuff in there, but you can key in by your CFDA number. It's the first 2 digits, then a period, and then the next 3 digits is how you get to the guidelines. When you are getting ready to set up your budget, hopefully everybody knows this, but from time to time we do have questions about which fund does the money go in. It goes into the special aid fund unless you've been told differently. Most grants that you apply for that are competitive are accounted for in these areas, so it's very good to just get familiar with that, use it. Most of the codes are the same. It's just they have an F in the front of them for those of us who are BOCES. It's very good to also remember that there are specific revenue codes that are identified for various sources of state and federal funding. And I believe on page 111 of the Comptroller's Guide for School Districts that you have the revenue codes that are assigned to various sources of funding. Your auditors will need this. The Comptroller's Office looks to make sure that your sources are properly designated. You don't just put it in a miscellaneous category. So it's helpful to pay attention to those types of revenue codes. When we get ready to, when we've been notified that we've won a grant, we usually need to meet and set up the budget. If the approval has been given but there's changes, we need to review what those changes were. From time to time, they will return an FS10 or an FS20 application, and they will change a figure. So that means that when you're setting up your budgets, you need to make sure that everything lines up with what the approved amount is and for each group of categories. We work with the program folks and set up line item detail and make sure that everything balances out to the categories that were in the original grant application. We find it helpful to review our spending procedures, our purchasing procedures, because most of the people who are in managing grants, this may be their very first time managing a small budget, and they need to be familiar with some of the aspects that they haven't been working with in the past. And it can be a frightening prospect if they don't know how to navigate the purchasing system and how to read budget status reports. We also work with them to review the costs that are allowed and sometimes the distinction in how you classify costs. Some things that seem to be a supply might actually be considered contractual, and some things that they consider our equipment may be supplies because in most of the grants, the equipment threshold is $5,000 per unit. So there's a little more education usually when we're setting up these budgets, and we try to work with these folks right out of the gate in setting up the budget and getting them familiar with the reporting process, because we want them to be as well-versed and as successful as possible. We also try to make them aware of the compliance circulars and the website without it becoming onerous for them, because they do need to know what is expected of them from a documentation standpoint and a reporting standpoint. We also go through the reporting requirements and we determine who's responsible for what. And we also need a plan of how they think they're going to be spending the funds. If it's a rather small grant and they have one deliverable that is way at the end, we may not be able to request funding right up front. We had that situation with a grants archive report, an archives grant a couple of years ago where it was a year-long process, and the only thing that we had to do under that grant was have a study done. So we didn't really need to worry about requesting funding because the whole process to get to the very end was the deliverable of this consultant's report for best practices for our archiving. So that's one of the key things, is how are they planning on spending their money? Sometimes it isn't as equivalent amounts each month. Sometimes there's a lot up front, but we need that so that we've got an idea of how they're managing the grant. Again, we discuss the documentation, make sure that they are aware of what they have to maintain, and we do set up periodic reviews with them. Depending on the size of the grant, it's usually quarterly. Some of the bigger ones, it's monthly. And we make sure that they know that if they're on track with their spending, we make sure that they're aware of when their closing dates are. We also have some purchasing cutoff deadlines that they need to be aware of when they're purchasing things so that we can make sure we get all of our invoices in and processed in a timely fashion. So it's a discussion throughout the year with our grant program people to make sure that everything is moving along as best as they can. And we want them to spend all the grant money. No, there isn't any award for turning back money. You've gotten it, make sure that you're able to use it, and we try to do our very best to make sure that we don't have to have unspent grant funds. From time to time, you need a budget amendment, and we try to minimize these, but sometimes they are unavoidable. The threshold is always the 10% or $1,000, whichever is greater, in a category. Now, keep in mind a category isn't a line item on a budget, but it's in those categories, and that's why we suggest the use of the FS10s to make sure that everybody is aware of what exactly goes into a category, because there could be several lines for supplies or for contractual. If you're changing your personnel positions, that is something that's going to require an amendment. If you don't get that and you report a title that wasn't necessarily in alignment with what you were approved for, they can disallow your reimbursement, and you don't want that to happen. Equipment purchases are the same thing. It's a unit cost of $5,000 or more. If you got lucky and you bought an item and it's even with shipping and everything else, it was less than $5,000, it needs to be moved to the supplies, and you'll probably have to increase supplies. Same thing with a supply that you thought would squeak in under the $5,000 threshold. It now becomes an equipment purchase. You have to get your approval, but you've got to make sure that you don't order it before you get your amendment approval, because that's going to be a no. Minor remodeling, we don't see much, but once in a while it does come out that there is some remodeling required, and if you have any changes for that, it has to be prior approved before you spend the funding. And as we've said, the amendments do require planning. They take time to get approval. We've had some that have been months. It stalls the process. We have a procedure here where we don't let our grant folks spend their money until they have an approved amendment, because we don't want to be in a position of spending the money and then having the amendment not come through. So planning is very important, and it has been a slow process in our experience over the last year or so as the state is scrutinizing some of the amendments a little more closely, and as I think they're just, quite frankly, thinner staffed all the way around. Now, the amendment forms are the FS10A. We use a practice of submitting the amendments prior to the start of the fourth quarter of any grant funding period, and it's solely so that we can ensure that we get that amendment back before the end of the grant funding period. You can't send in an amendment after the end of the funding period. They won't approve it, so that's why you really have to watch what you're doing. Again, they have several of the forms for the FS10As, Excel, Word, and PDF, and they are also available at the Grant Finance website, and very easy to use. It's just a 2-column sheet. Make sure that they balance. That's the best thing, one of the best things that we can tell you. This is what is the front page of the amendment. You just make sure that your agency code, your project number are correct, and we make sure that our amendment numbers are sequential and that we don't mess up with our amendment numbers when we do submit them. You do need to get your superintendent's signature on it before you send it in. And here it is, pretty simple sheet. Doesn't give you a lot of room to explain your changes, so sometimes you may need to have an attachment, but by and large, your increases and your decreases should come out to be the same number, unless you've gotten a letter from the state that is increasing your grant award, and those are few and far between. So here we go, and that's pretty easy. Budget management is something that we do spend a bit of time on. We encourage our grant people to learn how to read a budget status report, learn what encumbered funds are, what unencumbered funds are. We do meet with our grant folks, so as we've mentioned. We also find it helpful to keep referring back to the original grant submission to make sure that everything is being addressed. If we made a comment that we're going to be purchasing something or performing something, we need to make sure that things are going along in a timely fashion and that everything is being done so that we're meeting the goals that we have said that we are going to achieve. Same thing with the planning of the amendments. We need to allow sufficient time. We also do a cutoff of purchasing towards the end of the year because we need to make sure that the goods or the services are delivered or performed before the end of the year. It makes it a lot easier to close up a grant if you have all of your final purchases and final invoices in and taken care of. That way you don't have to worry about estimating encumbrances. Again, we want to make sure that all of the expenditures are incurred within the time frame that is covered by the grant. You can't go back and allocate something to the grant that was prior to the grant start date, and if it hasn't been encumbered by the time the grant is ending, generally it's going to be disallowed. The other thing is, what is an allowable cost? Usually those are spelled out in the grant with the goals and objectives. And one of the things that you need to keep in mind is that it's got to be reasonable and necessary. One of the examples that was given to me way back when I first started with grants, we had some folks that wanted to buy some very expensive day planners that were like $30 or $40 a piece. And the program office questioned their expenditure and said, well, what do the other employees who are in your classification get for planners? And the answer was they got them off from a cooperative bid, and they were about $2 a piece. So you couldn't enrich the planners and have very fancy planners that were $40 a piece when everybody else was using $2 planners because it wasn't reasonable and it wasn't necessary. That's something that you have to keep in mind. And an allowable cost can vary from one grant to the next. You really do have to pay attention to your documents. You really have to look at what the goals and objectives are. We have had some grants that were very specific and limiting. So we'd have to revise the grant to make sure that we were not including a cost in the proposal that was in conflict with what was determined to be allowed in the RFP or the grant announcement. The other thing is no double dipping. It should go without saying, but if it's covered by another program, you can't include it in the grant. It doesn't happen very often, but just to be sure, you only get reimbursed once. There are certain other requirements that may crop up. You've got federal funding sources this year, which may be quite new, especially because of the threshold to the ERA funding. The federal compliance guidelines are much more complicated than in the past under the state guidelines. The one that has gotten a lot of attention, and it's a struggle, is if your employee is not 100% paid out of a grant, and it is a federally funded grant, then you need the employee time and distribution certification. If they're 100%, you can do it just every 6 months, sign off that all of their time is devoted to the grant and maintain that documentation. However, when an employee is working only part-time, you have to maintain something that is akin to a time log to make sure that the distribution of their time is in alignment with the FTE that is going to be charged to the grant. It complicates things. That is something that is rather new to the world of education, and it's something that we have seen when we had the SED come in and audit one of our programs. We had people who were allocated to multiple grants, and they wanted to see those certifications. So it's very important that you remember to keep those in a file. They suggest that it's maintained with the payroll record. If there's other filing systems that work for you for making sure your grant documentation is in the appropriate place, then we encourage you to do that. You also need to look at making sure you're getting paid. Some school districts have minimal amounts of grant funding, so they may not pay a lot of attention to submitting their reimbursement requests. Here at Questar, we usually have between $4 and $6 million a year in grant funding, so we pay pretty close attention to the timelines to make sure that we're getting our money. This year, we'll all notice that they're a little bit slower to pay in some respects, but they have issued new guidance. They used to let you advance for a quarter. Now it's been cut down to a month, but we do keep track of our spending to make sure that when we have exceeded the amount of revenue that we currently have been given, that we are ready to file another FS-25 to get the next advance. You need to set up thresholds that really work for your particular business office, your district, to make sure that you're not filing something more frequently than you need, because it does take time to prepare the FS-25, and we do strongly recommend that it is the business office that prepares and submits the reports, just because sometimes the program folks, if they are allowed to do this, may forget certain costs, and depending on how you're encumbering your funds for your salaries and your fringe benefits. Here's what the FS-25 now looks like. It's pretty much the same as in the past, but you will notice that up in the upper right-hand corner, it does say 909, which indicates that that's the most recent. Again, it's available off the website, and the only significant change in this is in number 4, cash expenditures anticipated during the next month. So they aren't giving you the option of quarter or month. It's pretty much just the next month. And this is the back of the form, pretty much self-explanatory, but it does give you some pretty clear guidance on how they want you to look at the funding. When you get all said and done towards the end of the year, you need to start really thinking about your final expenditure reporting. We start thinking about that a little bit before the end of the year is upon us, mostly because we want to cut off the purchasing and make sure that all of the costs are allocated. A few years ago, the state sent out a directive and gave us the luxury of using what we call the short form. And if you file on time, you can use the short form. But on time means 30 days after the end of the funding period. For us, most of our grants end on June 30th, and that means that we have to file all of our reports for the state-funded things by July 30th. And it is a struggle because you're trying to close out the end of your fiscal year, you're trying to make sure that all of your invoices are paid on time, and it can really put you into a crunch to get that taken care of. But it is a lot easier to do the short form report, which basically looks like your FS-20. You just report you complete the front page and you complete the summary of the categories, and it gives them the state a lot less detail of what you spent your money on. The long form report, the regular report, takes a lot of effort because you have to detail all of your expenditures and all the payments to vendors. So there is a lot of benefit to being organized and up to date enough so that you can get everything done within the time frame to use the short form report. Federal grants do use the 90 days, which is a lot easier for us because we're usually ready in 90 days. However, we have noticed that the ERA funding is seeming to require the long forms. So that is going to be something that will not let you off the hook and use the short form. The other thing that is important is if there are final narrative reports or progress reports or a report out of any kind that is required from the program side, that we make sure that those are submitted. You won't get your final payment usually until those have been submitted to the program offices and accepted. So we got to make sure that everybody's on top of these things. And if you've got 10-month staff and a June 30 end date, your 10-month staff may not be available in the summer to submit their final reports, and that can delay your payment as well. And those are, those two forms are out on the website, and they're there for you to review. If you're not familiar with the long form, because you're newer to this, we would suggest that you take a look at it. Again, it can be done in Word, Excel, or PDF. Those of you who may use WinCap, you may be able to download some of your expenditures into an Excel spreadsheet and prepare a long form that way. It does save a little time. One of the things we do before we get ready to do the final expenditure is look at your expenditure detail. Make sure that the coding of your expenses look appropriate. Sometimes when people are filling out their purchase orders, they may make a mistake in coding, and you need to be sure that things are paid in the appropriate categories. One of the things is payments to BOCES, because that comes under a separate section, so you have to be a little alert to some of those types of payments. You also want to make sure that your spending is within the categories allowed by your budget. You don't want to go over that 10% without the amendment, because they will deny reimbursement on anything that is over the 10%. Make sure that you've got your documentation for your part-time FTE people, and then make sure you set up a time to review the matching contributions. Make sure you've got all of your documentation for your budget amendments. If you've gotten any additional correspondence from SED that's pertinent, make sure your grant files are in good order, because you have a 6-year archive retention period, and it won't necessarily be 5 months after the end of the grant that they may come in and audit. It might be a couple years down the road, so it's easier to have everything in order when you're closing up the grant and have it all be in one spot, so that if you do have to produce something for an audit, it's there. Here's the new guidance that was put out from the SED website for the ERA funding, and this gives you the codes, the CFDA codes that they are currently using, and it also tells you the form that you need to use to do your final report out. So what we've noticed is that the majority of these are all the FS10 long forms, and it also tells you the limits on the reimbursement that you can get before final payment, and usually it's 90% of the total amount of the grant, but there are a couple of the grants under ERA that are limited to something less than 90%. So if you haven't found this on the website, it might be a good idea to go out and look for it to make sure that you know what they're expecting. We've included our web resources. The State Ed website has a number of opportunities for notices of grant funding, and either you or your program folks should be reviewing that from time to time. We don't do a lot with other funding sources. Most of the funding comes through the State Ed department. From time to time we have gotten grants directly from the federal government, but because we're a BOCES, our opportunities are usually a little more limited in that respect. The Grants Finance Unit website within State Ed has a lot of resources. The guidelines that are out there are very helpful. They do update them. They can answer a lot of questions for you so that you don't have to call your contacts at SED. They're usually very good and up to date. We strongly suggest that you monitor your grants. It gives you an opportunity to look and see where your grants are in the approval process. So there is some information out there, and it's very helpful. Even at the end of the year when it's audit time, there's a lot of good information that's out there. That catalog of federal domestic assistance is helpful for meeting federal programmatic requirements. It's a huge publication, but you will likely only need small segments of it. So if you review the sections that correspond to your particular funding source, it can help you with that. EDGAR is one. If you get Perkins money, if you get IDA money, the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, they also provide some assistance in determining allowable costs, what things are appropriate, and that is usually some of the regulations that a lot of our ERA funding is falling under as well. If you get more than $500,000 in federal funding, you are subject to what is called a single audit. If you haven't hit that threshold in the past, and this year you are because you've gotten ERA funding, you may want to have a conversation with your external auditors before they would come in for the planning stages. The Circular A87 gives a lot of guidelines as to how state and local governments can allocate costs to federal grants. However, one of the things that we've found is, despite the fact that we have a lot of funding from federal sources, the state is more restrictive in a lot of cases for the use of those funds than what the Circular A87 is. So we do watch both, and I guess we usually go with the most restrictive, which is usually the state's requirements, although A87 is a very good publication to become familiar with for determining allowable costs. And I guess now it's time for some questions.
Okay, thank you, Star. And we actually have 4 questions, and we encourage you to ask others. And Leo will tell us how you can phone in a question.
Okay. The first question that I have
Well, let's see, is from Mary Gibson. I'm sorry, it's from Gail.
I got one from Peter.
Well, Peter, hopefully Peter has his handouts.
Okay.
Gail Lanthrop wants to know, do employees that are paid from federal or state grants need to be notified by letter each year?
Here at Questar, we don't notify them. I don't know that there's any requirement. Usually our employees that are paid through a grant know that they're paid through a grant. I think it would depend really on what your bargaining unit contract states. If their jobs are tentative or only going to last through the grant funding, I would think that they should know that, and you would probably be, as a best practice, communicate that. We do have a number of employees who are employed solely through grants. We have several grants that are no longer continuing after June 30th of 2010, and we have already notified those employees that their funding source is not continuing. I think it's only a fair way to perhaps deal with the employees themselves to make them aware of the discontinuation of a funding source.
Okay, thank you. Now, before we go on to our next question, if you would like to phone in a question, you just hit 7#, and then you'll be connected to us. The second question we have is from Mary Gibson, and Mary is saying, with regard to budget codes, Are online course materials considered contractual or supplies? Previously, books and materials were ordered, but now the students and teachers go online.
We normally treat those types of items as supplies only because their nature is of a consumable. However, if we have a written contractual agreement that extends beyond the grant period, that goes from year to year, other than just the current year, those could be contractual in nature, and we would include them as such. But most of ours are smaller dollar amounts. They aren't large, so we consider those supplies.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question from Jane Ryan. And Jane wants to know, where can you find a copy of a PAR document?
Well, the interesting thing is they haven't really ever put one out. However, several of the districts in Questar's region have developed their own, and some are very good, and they have been willing to share that with others. That's one of the struggles. They don't really prescribe the form. They just kind of leave it up to each individual entity to come up with something that works in their particular situation. So I think that there are some people out there that have it, and we could try to contact the ones that we know of that have what we consider to be a good form, and ask if they'd be willing to share it with folks.
Yeah, and we could certainly provide that to everyone who is on the webinar.
Yes, we would be more than happy to.
Yeah. And we're on our last question, so we encourage those of you who do have questions to either phone it in, and you'll see that Leo sent out and said just press 7# on your phone, or send us an email chat. And the last question we have so far, and hoping for more, is from Kristen Alexander, and the question is, are these minor shifts in funding that can be done with internal budget modification forms backed up by an amendment, I assume? I was not aware you could make changes without an amendment.
The small changes that are under the 10% or $1,000 threshold to just move money around between the categories, we do keep paper documentation in the grant file in the business office for those small modifications. Frequently, we don't have to file a formal amendment. However, if a larger modification is required subsequent to making a smaller group of modifications, we make sure that all of the modifications up to the point of the amendment are included in the amendment. But if there's smaller things, we have had no problem reallocating funds without a formal amendment, as long as we didn't hit the 10% threshold or trigger an equipment purchase or change in FTE. So, but when we do an amendment, if there's been smaller things, it is included. It's all encompassing.
Okay, thank you. And for those of you who are looking to print the presentation, if you go back to your confirmation email where you clicked on the link to join the webinar, underneath is where the handouts are, and you can print them from there. So yes, they are available. Star, how long have you been doing grants and grant funding?
Oh, you're gonna make me age myself. I started as an external auditor with a CPA firm that primarily did school districts, and I got a number of years' experience in the early 80s, before a lot of these requirements were even in their current form. And I have been working pretty much exclusively either as a CPA auditing school districts or as a treasurer business official since 1998 in the school setting. So I guess now we're working on another 12 or 13 years besides my previous experience. And I had also spent a couple of years with Ernst & Young and we did some larger entities affiliated with state ed, like the SUNY Research Foundation that had significant grant funding as well. So grant compliance has evolved and changed over the years, and I've kind of watched it grow.
Well, certainly good background for this information. We have a question here from Susan, and she says, in December we sent in an FS-25 for the stabilization grant. When might we expect payment?
Our experience with the FS-25, it usually takes a minimum of a month, but up to 2 months. But with these ERA funding and with the state fiscal crisis, our experience has been that everything has been slowed down a little bit. We usually let it go to the point of 2 months, and if we haven't gotten our money, we start making phone calls. And we have found that the squeaky wheel does seem to get the grease, because we've been pretty successful at making like a weekly phone call when we're looking for a reimbursement, and they'll usually track it down if you've got a good grant contact at SED.
Okay, well, that's always good to know.
You'd have to contact the grant finance person to make sure that the program person actually sent in the FS-25. So that's where we usually start, is with grant finance, to make sure that it's been submitted to grant finance for payment processing.
Okay, so even though the person you sent it to, they need to send it on before payment can be processed.
Right.
Okay.
We've developed enough of a relationship that our grant finance people will usually call the program people and ask them where it is after we've made our second phone call.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
That always helps.
It helps to have friends at state ed.
Yes. Now, for those of you who are listening who don't and haven't developed that relationship
You can develop
yet.
that relationship. Yeah, you can develop that relationship. They're very nice. They're very helpful.
I've always found anyone I've worked with at state ed to be helpful.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. Any other things that you've learned over your years of experience that you'd like to share?
One of the cautions, I think, is that because you're dealing, your people, your program people are dealing with program people at state ed, and then we usually deal with the grant finance unit. You can get conflicting messages, but one of the things that we've always been told is that it's the grant finance's determination that is the final determination. So if a program person says a cost is allowable and grants finance says no, this isn't allowable, usually it's going to be grants finance that has the final say in this matter. So you have to really work with the two to make sure that they are on the same page, and frequently, unfortunately, at state ed, they aren't. And that's part of the balancing act of navigating between program and the payment office, which is grant finance.
Okay, that certainly is a good tip. Now we have another question here from Jane Ryan, and she says, have you heard of any federal audits commencing with the ARRA grants or ERA grants?
We haven't yet, but because there's a lot of money out there, we would expect that the comptroller's office may initiate their own set of grant compliance activities, and we wouldn't be surprised, given the past history with New York State and how they were cited for not spending federal dollars appropriately, if and because New York is such a large recipient of federal dollars, that the federal government would initiate an audit of New York State use of ERA funding, which would then trickle down to some of the other subrecipients, which would be our municipalities and school districts. We expect that it's coming, but not yet.
Okay, well, thank you. Anything else that you can think of? Document.
We've been through a few audits, and documentation has been the thing that has tripped us up, and it's usually the documentation on the program side to support the work that was done under a grant. And the last audit that targeted specifically the programs, most of our findings were with not having documentation of minutes, not having documentation to support that objectives were clearly accomplished. And there was a lot of paper, but for whatever reason on the program side, they didn't seem to think that there was sufficient documentation. And that is sometimes where it gets to be a bit of a challenge, is to make sure that you've got enough but not too much.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do have auditors coming in, it's just like dealing with the OSC. Get them their information as quickly as you possibly can. We have a little bit of a policy here. We don't let them have free access to our files. We prefer to pull the information that they're requesting ourselves so that we can control what they're getting and not let them go on a fishing expedition. So I think that's one of the things in dealing with the grants people. We've tried, or the audit people, we've tried to have a coordinated point of contact when it does come time for audits, and make sure that your documentation is there.
Okay. Certainly a good point, because that wouldn't want the grant to be not funded completely because of that.
Exactly.
Amy Morocco has a question, and she says, how do you handle accounting for indirect costs? Are they handled as an inter-fund transfer to general fund?
That is how we do handle our indirect costs here. We reimburse the general fund for whatever indirect is allocated to us from each of our grant programs, because realistically the cost that is supporting the indirect is a general fund cost. So it's an inter-fund transfer.
Okay. Any other tips or questions that come to mind? Once you start talking, sometimes there's all kinds of ideas that come out.
For those folks that are new to the federal compliance, on State Ed's website there is a PowerPoint presentation that was done for the State Education Department a few years back after the federal government had completed their audit of New York State's use of grant funding, and it's called the Federal Education Grants Management Requirements. And it's very helpful, and it helps to determine what costs are allowable and what costs aren't, and it gives a little bit of a peek into how the feds were looking at New York State. So if anybody is bored and really wants to look at that or is really interested in it, it's a pretty big document. It's actually probably over 120 pages or something like that. But it was kind of interesting what the federal government thought that New York State wasn't doing right in administering grants, and is also a key to some of us subrecipients as to what we needed to do.
And that maybe goes back to Jane Ryan's question about the ARRA auditing, that probably could give some hints there.
Exactly.
So good thought. Good thought.
But there's a lot of resources out there, so explore that website so that we can, hopefully use our funds wisely and not have any disallowances, and use them all, because no sense getting the funding and not being able to spend it, especially if you've got needs and can spend it appropriately.
Right, right. And tracking all of that is important, like you said, in the documentation, and being consistent. I think consistency was a good tip too. Yes.
And I think for some of the districts that are smaller, this will be their first time, perhaps even with single audit. So it'll be a new experience for the compliance testing and things of that nature. And it can be a burden sometimes to make sure that everything is there. But hopefully there's enough resources available with the NASBO peer group that we can help one another and make sure everybody is successful.
Yes, and I have found that certainly about people who belong to New York State ASBO, that our members do like to help others out. So don't be afraid to ask.
And if there's, we've provided at the end of our PowerPoint, if either Harry or I can answer a question, feel free to email, call, do whatever it is that needs to be done so that we can help you out.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Star, and I think you did a terrific job. And sorry Harry wasn't able to make it, but you certainly filled in for him extremely well. Thank you, all of you who are listening in. If you do have questions, you certainly can send them to me at New York State ASBO or to Star or Harry, and lots of resources were provided. So we appreciate you attending this webinar and look forward to you joining us for the next one, which is January 26th, and we're going to talk about special interest groups. We all seem to have them in our communities, and how do you deal with them well? And I encourage all of you, if you are not members of the New York State School Business Institute, to become a member so that you can get credit for all of these programs that you're attending. So thank you so very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you and having you join us on our next webinar.
Thank you.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending.
The moderator has ended the conference. Goodbye. Thank you for calling.